Courage is a fun topic to talk about after the fact, sitting in comfortable chairs with coffee and hot chocolate waiting for us outside. We love to hear about the amazing exploits of others, how they stood strong against evil, overcame adversity, defeated horrible enemies, and we imagine ourselves in their place doing the same. And I don't mean to imply that there's anything wrong with that. As we'll see, courage is tested under fire, but its foundation is constantly being laid at all times, especially in the good ones when you can really think clearly about it. But at the same time, learning about courage is very different from exercising it. It is virtually never fun when the time comes, especially because you never know how your courage will end. Making a courageous stand can end in glory and the praise of many people, but it can also end in social humiliation, poverty, and even painful death. It's also worse because, like our discussion of pain, no matter what you've been through, no matter what you've faced, you can almost always be sure that someone else has faced worse. For example, American Christians sometimes like to complain about persecution they've faced and tell stories about them bravely standing up to someone calling them names. I could tell stories like that, and they can sound dramatic until other people I know in the same room with me start talking about their Christian friends and family who've been arrested, attacked, or just disappear for good one day. I mean, here we are in Poland, a place where more courage has been displayed over the course of the 20th century than whole continents put together. Talking about this to people like this in a place like this is sobering at the very least. It means I am definitely not an expert on courage. Still, as we fulfill PIC's mission to come, grow, serve, and go, many of us sitting here right now are going to do incredible and difficult things that require a huge amount of courage. In fact, some of the people sitting in PIC today will go out and will accomplish things that historians like myself will one day come behind them and write books about. So while I am certainly in no place to lecture anyone on courage, over the course of the next few months, we're going to take a look at what God's Word has to say about courage and find what it has to teach us. Today, we'll begin looking at David, the man after God's own heart. To begin with, what do we mean when we tell someone to have courage? What is courage anyway? We need a good definition. Put very simply and generally, courage is making a decision to face something that scares you and to do the right thing even if you could run away. Let's unpack that a little bit. First, a big mistake that people make is to assume that courage is the absence of fear. That leads even courageous people making courageous choices to beat themselves up because when they're faced with the choice, they're terribly afraid. But that's poppycock. Fear is natural. Fear keeps you safe by warning you to avoid bad things that can hurt you. So it's perfectly normal to feel fear in any dangerous or stressful situation. We should be glad of it. People who literally feel no fear are like people who feel no pain. They are missing an important human safety feature and are far more likely to injure themselves or others than healthy people are. So, courage is making good and right decisions, even when you're so afraid you think you may pass out. Second, courage is always a choice. People tend to lose sight of that fact. In the real world, courage always occurs in difficult, messy situations where you have a choice to do the right thing or not. It's like generosity. Can I call myself a generous person because the government takes a big wet chunk out of my paycheck every month and gives it to poor people? Or am I generous when I give money and that I don't have to? Courage is the same way. People display courage when they take risks that they might otherwise have been able to avoid. Finally, to the Christian, there is another aspect to consider too. As we'll see when we talk about courage on Easter Sunday, the best examples of Christian courage require us to go a step farther than just facing our fears. We are also called to follow Christ's example in risking ourselves for others. So Christian courage is sacrificial. for the gospel, for our brothers and sisters, and even, and this is the hard part, for our enemies. We face threats. We take the chances so they won't have to. All in all, it is a very high and challenging goal to reach, especially in our daily lives. The first major point I'd like to consider is largely philosophical, but we'll see David give us the practical results shortly. Not only does God provide the Christian with the grounding of some kind of religious courage, when we think about it further, it turns out that He is also the grounds of all courage. He makes courage possible. So when we see someone acting courageously, we are in fact watching an affirmation of God Himself. Here's what I mean and what I don't mean. First, I don't mean that only Christians can act courageously. Human beings have a large variety of life experience and exercise free will, so there's nothing that stops a complete atheist from doing something like rescuing a child from a fire, any more than being a Christian means that you automatically will rescue the child from the fire. In fact, if I were to be saved by an atheist acting very courageously, I would sing all of the praises of that individual you could possibly want. We're all capable of the same physical actions and choices. Here's the difference. We can't call those actions good, right, or even useful in the absence of God. Atheism simply isn't philosophically constructed to support ideas like courage. In the absence of God, courage becomes pointless. Displaying courage is by definition risky, uncomfortable, and even dangerous. So the question is obvious, why do it? Well, most people say because it's right. Risking your own life to save that child is right in a moral sense. To say that, though, is to appeal to some larger, higher definition of right and wrong, what people call the moral law, and that is the rub. A law implies a lawgiver and a judge. Without those two things, there is no such thing as a law in a moral sense. Nature does not produce moral laws on its own. For example, when we talk about the law of gravity, we don't mean that nature wakes up in the morning and decides to bend space in order to make things stick together because it is the right thing to do, or that nature has a choice about it and one day may change its mind and try to do the wrong thing. All we mean is that, quote, things always happen that way, end quote. There is nothing right or wrong about the law of gravity. It just is. The same thing applies to human actions in the absence of God. Saving the child from the burning building isn't right or wrong. It just is. And your opinion might be different than mine on whether we should do it. Morality degenerates into opinion, and all opinions are equal. Worse, without God, there is no hope and no future. Life has no meaning. It just happens. So why should we call one pointless accident, risking its short, meaningless existence, to save the life of another equally pointless accident, a good thing? What if we want to say that running away from the fire, leaving the child to burn, and staying safe is the better thing? In the absence of God, they are all literally equal. But I hope you reacted to what I just said, by feeling a knot in your stomach and wanting to jump up and shout, "You're wrong!" I hope you find the idea of leaving a child to die horrible and wonder how anyone could ever suggest that it would be okay. If you feel that way, that's the moral law talking to you. It's something that transcends cultures and people, and it points us to the lawgiver himself. In that moment, you're literally listening to God's still small voice whispering to humanity. When we see someone display real courage, we're listening to that voice shout. So let's take a look at probably the most famous incident of courage in David's life. Welcome to the story of David and Goliath. I'm sure most of us are familiar with the life of David, the shepherd boy who fought the giant and became the king of Israel. If ever there was a mere man who repeatedly displayed courage, it was David. Of the many things that David did with his life, probably his contest with Goliath is the most famous. The story is told in 1 Samuel chapter 17, and this is from the New American Standard Bible. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Socoh, which belongs to Judah, and they camped between Socoh and Azekah, and Ephes-dammim. Saul and the men of Israel were gathered encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in battle array to encounter the Philistines. The Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, while Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with the valley between them. Then a champion came out from the armies of the Philistines, named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was clothed with scale armor, which weighed 5,000 shekels of bronze. He also had bronze greaves on his legs, and a bronze javelin slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the head of his spear weighed 600 shekels of iron. His shield carrier also walked before him. He stood out to the ranks of Israel and said to them, "Why do you come out to draw up in battle array? Am I not the Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will become your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall become our servants and serve us." And again the Philistine said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Moving on to verse 20. So David arose early in the morning and left the flock with the keeper, and took the supplies, and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the circle of the camp, while the army was going out in battle array, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines drew up in battle array, army against army. Then David left his baggage in the care of the baggage keeper, and ran to the battle line, and entered in order to greet his brothers. As he was talking to them, behold, the champion, the Philistine from Gath, named Goliath, was coming up from the army of the Philistines, and he spoke these same words, and David heard them. When all the men of Israel saw the man, they fled from him and were greatly afraid. The men of Israel said, "Have you seen this man who is coming up? Surely he is coming up to defy Israel. And it will be that the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel." Then David spoke to the men who were standing by him, saying, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should taunt the armies of the living God?" The people answered him according to this word, saying, "Thus it will be done for the man who kills him." Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger burned against David, and he said, "Why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your insolence and the wickedness of your heart, for you have come down in order to see the battle." But David said, "What have I done now? Was it not just a question?" Then he turned away from him to another, and said the same thing, and the people answered him the same thing as before. When the words which David spoke were heard, they told them to Saul, and he sent for David. David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail on account of him. Your servant will go up and fight with this Philistine." Then Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, while he has been a warrior from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant was tending his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him, and I attacked him, and rescued it from his mouth. And when he rose up against me, I seized him by his beard, and struck him, and killed him. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has taunted the armies of the living God." And David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and may the Lord be with you." So what was it that made David different from all the other soldiers in Israel? Why was he able to slay Goliath when no one else could? It obviously wasn't his military training. The Bible tells us in verses 12 and 13 that Jesse had 3 sons out of 8 in the army. That means that David wasn't left behind because he was the youngest and therefore was the only one available to help his father. There were 4 other boys who could have also helped. He probably stayed behind because he wasn't the strongest or the most experienced warrior in the family. There were 2 things that made David stand out over even his brothers. First and most important was simply this: David knew and trusted God. Better, he believed that God kept his promises. When faced with the very real threat of Goliath, he came to what should have been the natural and logical conclusion. If we all believe in God, why don't we act like it? And how did the people around David respond? "Oh my, I see that you have brought this to my attention that I should believe in God and trust him to keep his promises. I have been suitably chastised, and I am changing my mind. Let's go get that Philistine. Thank you, David, for making such a strong and principled stand." No. They mocked him. His own brother tried to shame him. And this was, of course, insult to injury. As if Goliath wasn't frightening enough, David could fear being made to look like an idiot by his own brother in front of the army. Frankly, I'm not sure which would scare most of us more. One interesting point to note here, though. Saul usually gets a bad rap when we talk about David, but I think we tend to forget that he was also God's anointed, and for good reason. In a very real way, he is also displaying courage via a belief in God and God's promises. I mean, think about it. Would you pin the hopes of your nation on a skinny teenager who looks after sheep if you didn't also believe in the God who sent him? Certainly not. So in trusting David, however imperfectly, Saul was also finding his courage in God. Interestingly, David never forgot this fact about Saul, and that led him to display courage later too, but we'll talk about that after Easter. And this leads us to our third point, which I will admit ripping off wholesale from Christian investigative reporter Julie Roys. David's courage didn't suddenly appear out of thin air. He wasn't just walking around one day and suddenly decided to become super courageous and tackle a legendary enemy in pitched battle. David's courage was something that he exercised on many occasions before Goliath, in all the smaller things that no one really cared to notice. For years before facing that giant, David had been displaying courage when no one was looking. He faced down wild animals, storms, and probably many other frightening things to protect his father's sheep entirely by himself and without thanks. No one cared. When the war came, they thought so little of his skill that they left him behind, and his brother even mocked him for it. People didn't reward his previous acts of courage, but that made them no less courageous. But as David himself tells Saul in verses 34 through 37, it was all those smaller, unnoticed displays of courage that prepared him for the one moment that mattered. It's no different today. You can't take someone who has spent their life on the couch and suddenly expect them to run a marathon, or let alone win it. They have to practice over and over again until they're strong enough. No one watches or cares or notices all the times they pound the pavement day after day. They're just some random person out for another run, but without all that exercise, they can never cross the finish line when it matters. Courage, therefore, is like a muscle. The more you work it, the bigger and the stronger it gets. So what does this all mean? What are the takeaways? First, I think we should remember that God is the source of all meaningful courage. Every time we exercise or see someone exercise courage and we know that it is good, we are watching God's design in action. People ask, when does God speak to me? When we exercise the moral law or watch others doing it, we are listening directly to His voice. It is also a powerful reminder that while being a Christian is no guarantee that you will be courageous, you have a very strong incentive to make courageous choices. It is literally a call from God. Next, our courage is based on our relationship with God in Christ. The stronger the relationship, the better able we are to show courage when it matters. This in itself is a relief and a mandate. The relief is that our courage doesn't depend on us or our strength. We don't have to shoulder that load. We just trust Him and follow in His steps. It is a mandate in that we must draw as close to Him as we possibly can to be sure that we can be courageous when it matters. And finally, our courage comes from practice. As we display courage in the small things, we prepare to display it in the big ones. Matthew 25:14 through 30, the story of the talents, is another example of this. In that parable, when the master leaves to go on his trip, he leaves each of 3 servants with a small amount of money. The 2 that wisely invest their money grow their talents, and when the master returns, he rewards them by giving them more opportunities and more responsibilities. It's just the same with courage. If we want to grow in God and Christ, if we want Him to trust us with more, then we must consciously and consistently exercise our courage in the smaller things in order to strengthen them for the bigger ones. So as we move through the next week, let's remember where our courage comes from and look for chances to exercise it. After all, we never know when we might be called upon to face our own giants.